Corporal Evan Blake had never been good with silence, especially not in places like this, jungles that pulsed with heat and life, under skies unfamiliar and hungry. Iridia was unlike any planet he'd been stationed on. Its beauty was startling and otherworldly, all bioluminescent vines and translucent trees that whispered secrets when the wind stirred. As part of the United Terran Diplomatic Escort Unit, his mission was clear: accompany the linguists and negotiators, stay out of cultural entanglements, and above all, don't speak unless spoken to. He was trying. Really, he was. But no one had prepared him for her. They were introduced in the garden of the high-blooming council, beneath towering silver-petaled trees. She emerged from the shadows like a vision sculpted out of liquid crystal, her skin smooth and shifting in tone with the canopy light. She stood tall, quiet, serene. There was something ancient in her gaze, not age, but depth, as if her eyes had studied centuries and chosen not to speak of them. The diplomat beside Evan cleared his throat. "Corporal Blake, this is Nalani of the Eastern Wind, daughter of the Speaker of the Dawn Circle. She has offered to serve as our cultural liaison during your station." Evan, caught in the weight of her gaze, blinked and said the first thing that came to him. "Beautiful." It wasn't loud, barely more than a breath, but it hung in the air like thunder. Nalani's eyes widened slightly, not in offense but something sharper. A subtle shift passed through her expression. The other Iridians present froze. Even the diplomat's forced smile faltered. Evan's stomach sank. "What?" he asked, already regretting everything. Zara, the team's primary translator and resident xenocultural expert, slowly turned her head toward him, her face pale with horror. "You just proposed." "I what?" "To her. You just proposed marriage. In Iridian culture, beautiful isn't a compliment, it's a declaration. It means you see the soul, it means you see eternity." Evan stared at her dumbfounded. "But I just—" Zara raised a trembling hand. "You said it in front of the speaker's daughter, and she heard you." Nalani stepped closer, silent, her eyes fixed on Evan. There was no offense in her gaze, no mockery, only stillness. "You see me," she said. Not a question, a statement. Evan's throat went dry. I mean I wasn't trying to." Her hand lifted, not threatening, calm. She placed it gently over her chest, then extended it toward him. "You have named me beautiful," she said. "I must now walk with you, or you must walk away and dishonor me." Zara's voice broke in a whisper. "You can't walk away, not from her, not here." And Evan Blake, a soldier trained for war but never for this, realized he'd just stepped into a union older than diplomacy, deeper than policy, all because he'd spoken the truth. They walked in silence through the flowering corridors of the speaker's palace, escorted by two Iridian attendants who bore robes of ivory and woven stone. Evan's boots clanked awkwardly on the polished crystal floor, a jarring rhythm beside the grace of the others. Every step deepened his unease, not because he feared what lay ahead, but because a part of him didn't. Zara followed behind, muttering quietly in a desperate stream. "This is not protocol. You weren't supposed to speak. How did you even notice her? You barely blink when artillery fires over your head." Evan glanced back. It was instinct. Your instincts might have just bonded you to the highest-ranking unwed Iridian in 2 continents. "I said one word, and here that word is enough. Gods help you." Nalani walked ahead of them, her presence unshaken. Her movement wasn't just fluid, it was purposeful, as if each motion carried the gravity of ritual. She led them through a threshold of vine-laced arches into a chamber lit entirely by floating spores that pulsed in time with the room's breath. The walls shimmered with living paint, images of unions past, figures clasping hands under starlight, faces leaning into one another over blooming trees. This was not a place of rejection. This was where vows were witnessed. Evan halted at the entrance, unwilling to go farther. "This is moving too fast." Nalani turned to face him, still serene. "The bond does not wait for understanding. It waits for truth. You spoke your truth." He ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean it as a proposal, but you meant the word." He couldn't argue. "Yes." A soft breath escaped her, like a sigh of confirmation. "Then you are not a stranger to me anymore." Zara hissed through her teeth. "Evan, if you accept this, you're bound. For life. Iridians don't dissolve bonds. They don't annul. You'll be seen as part of her house, her soul pair." Nalani approached him slowly, placing her palm against the center of his chest. Her skin was warm, her eyes unflinching. I will not force what is not returned, she said. But if you walk away now, you will cut something that was beginning to bloom. Evan's pulse hammered. I don't even know you, he whispered. Not with your mind, but your heart recognized me before your words did. He looked at her hand against his chest, then back into those ancient eyes, and wondered, for the first time in years, if the battlefield he was truly meant to stand upon wasn't one of war, but of belonging. Outside, the spores pulsed brighter. Inside, Evan took one slow breath, and didn't step away. By the following morning, Evan's name had traveled through every vine-stitched corridor of the capital city. He wasn't just the human who stumbled through a first-contact mission. He was now the suitor of Nalani, daughter of the Dawn Circle, blood tied to the speaker of Iridia's eastern quadrant. The soldiers who once ignored him nodded in stiff acknowledgement. The couriers paused their deliveries to glance his way. Even the guards at the palace gates lowered their eyes respectfully, or perhaps warily, as he passed. Zara walked 3 steps behind him with the gait of someone awaiting imminent doom. She no longer chided him. She was too exhausted, too worried that the human race might inadvertently offend an entire civilization because a soldier with calloused hands and tired eyes saw beauty where he shouldn't have. In the ceremonial garden, Evan was fitted with bonding silks, cloth grown not woven, dyed with the pollen of songshell blossoms. He didn't argue, though the material itched at the nape of his neck. Iridians did nothing half-heartedly, not even marriage. Nalani waited beneath the humming bloom tree, where lovers in Iridian lore first swore themselves to one another during the Age of Water. Her robes cascaded like a waterfall made of starlight. She did not smile when she saw him, but she nodded, as if confirming again what had already been accepted. Zara cleared her throat and motioned for him to step forward. The rite of clarification must be spoken. If you are to withdraw, this is your only chance. I'm not withdrawing, Evan said. She blinked. You're not? He didn't answer. He just stepped forward. He'd spent the night pacing in his quarters, torn between duty and something quieter, stranger. Something that refused to be ignored. A feeling that had no battlefield, no tactic, no enemy. A kind of yearning that he'd mistaken for danger. But it wasn't danger. It was recognition. Nalani tilted her head when he stopped before her. You understand what this means, she said. No, Evan admitted, but I want to. A slow breath left her lips. Then she turned toward the altar and placed her hands on a shallow bowl filled with silver sap. It pulsed with light. She turned to him and extended one hand, her fingers glistening with it. Then place your hand in mine, and let Iridia witness what your words have begun. Evan reached out. Their palms met. The sap crawled over their fingers, winding around them like living metal. Light flared, and the bond took hold, not just in flesh, but in presence, in something unseen. Somewhere in the jungle, the wind shifted. Animals stilled. The forest paused, as if the planet itself acknowledged the moment. And in Evan's chest, something long buried stirred. Not love, not yet, but the seed of it, waiting. After the rite, Evan was led through the hanging bridges of Nalani's ancestral estate. Suspended between cliffs that overlooked the sea of cradle winds, the bridges swayed gently as if to a rhythm known only to the stars. Below them, the water shimmered gold and blue. The estate loomed ahead, carved from stone and vine, ancient and dignified. A place of lineage, tradition, and silence. Nalani said little during the walk. She led with the grace of someone who had always known her place in the world. Evan followed like a man trying to learn the steps of a song he'd only just begun to hear. His boots echoed differently here. The air was thicker. Time felt slower. Inside, the walls were etched with stories, murals of those who had come before her. Warriors, scholars, artists, men and women who had carved peace from generations of ritual. This was her world, a place where every gesture meant something, where a glance, a word, a breath could change a life. They stopped in the central hall, where a tree grew from the center of the room. Its roots disappeared into the stone, and its canopy reached through the open ceiling into the night. Small glass orbs hung from its branches, each one containing a spark of light. The tree of vows, Nalani said. Every union adds a light. Evan stared at the orbs. Hundreds of them. I don't know what I've done, he whispered. Nalani looked at him. You honored me. I didn't mean to. But you did. That is why it matters. He turned toward her fully. What if I'm not enough? What if I don't fit this world? You are not meant to fit, she said, stepping closer. You are meant to grow beside it, as I must grow beside you. He felt it again, that strange pull. Not just toward her, but toward the stillness she carried. The certainty. She wasn't asking him to change overnight. She wasn't demanding love. She was offering patience, presence, and that was somehow more terrifying than affection. He took a deep breath. This bond, this isn't about owning or submitting, is it? No, Nalani said. It is about walking, together. They stood beneath the tree in silence, two strangers, no longer strangers, and when Evan reached out and touched the bark, a small orb blinked into existence. Not bright, not burning, but lit, and that, he realized, was enough, for now. Evan Blake had never been a man of rituals. Earth's military had tried to drill it into him, salutes, ranks, protocols, but even then, he'd only half learned the dances. Now he was living in a place where every blink, every tilt of the head carried layered meanings, and his words, his accidental word, had changed the course of two lives. Nalani had returned to her duties in the Speaker's Council. Evan was given quarters in her ancestral home, not out of obligation, but because tradition insisted the bond be witnessed by the household. The servants never said a word to him, but their eyes followed his every move. The guards outside his door changed shifts like clockwork, but never addressed him. Zara visited occasionally, her warnings softer now, more curious than panicked. She hasn't rescinded it, Zara said over a shared bowl of steaming root broth. Rescinded what? The bond. You do know she still could. She's powerful enough to refuse, even now. Evan looked down into the bowl. She doesn't want to. And you? Zara asked carefully. He didn't answer at first. Outside the window, Nalani stood near the garden pool, speaking softly to the koi-like fish that hovered just above the water's surface. Her voice carried like music, even when the words were incomprehensible. I didn't plan for any of this, he said finally, but I feel like I've stepped into a current I don't want to fight. Zara nodded, then let it carry you. Later that evening, Nalani invited him to walk with her. No ceremony, no crowd, just the two of them on a bridge that swayed over the silver-lit water. She held no title in that moment, and he wore no uniform. I was told your people bond with a ring, she said, a circle worn on the finger. What does it mean? Evan thought for a moment. It's a promise, a symbol. It says you and I belong to each other, and that's not going to change. Nalani looked out toward the distant waves. Then it is the same. It's not always permanent, he added, carefully. She turned to him. But would you mean it as such? He met her eyes. I think I would if I said it. Nalani studied him for a long time. I know you are afraid, but Iridia does not demand love. It only honors what is honest. He nodded slowly. Then you should know something. When I called you beautiful, it wasn't just your face. It was how still you were in a world that moves too fast. It was how the room changed when you walked into it. I didn't mean to say it, but I didn't lie. She smiled, just faintly, but it was the kind that lit the world beneath it. Then she said, "Thank you for meaning it." And they stood there, quiet together, with no need to speak. The peace of the days that followed was not without tension. While Evan adjusted to Iridia's ways, learning its language, its customs, and the quiet rhythm of its people, news began to drift in from the Western Territories. A mining delegation from a neighboring colony world had landed without invitation, claiming that Iridia held valuable mineral veins beneath its southern plains. They offered gifts, smiles, and treaties, but their ships carried weapons and their words carried threats. The Speaker's Council gathered in urgent sessions. Nalani was summoned to speak for her quadrant, and though Evan was not permitted inside the chamber, he saw the exhaustion in her shoulders when she returned. He knew that weight. He'd worn it during wars that didn't begin with bullets, but always ended with them. They're probing, she said to him one night as they shared fruit beneath the star canopy. Testing how much they can take before we push back. What will your people do? She closed her eyes. We'll endure. That is what Iridia does. Evan exhaled. That's not always enough. She opened her eyes. What would you do? He hesitated. If they're armed, then they've already decided what they're willing to fight for. But they don't know you, not like I do. They think they can speak louder than your silence. Nalani looked at him. Then show them what silence can become. He didn't need orders. He began gathering what he needed. communications relays, defensive perimeter designs, strategy maps. Not to start a war, but to prevent one. The day the foreign envoy marched toward the southern plains with their suits gleaming and their soldiers masked, they found Evan standing at the edge of the sacred grove, wearing no armor, but surrounded by Iridian warriors whose eyes glowed with resolve. Nalani stood beside him, her ceremonial robes traded for the plain garb of one who has nothing to prove. "This land is not unclaimed," Evan said calmly, "and the woman beside me is not undefended." The envoy smirked. "You speak for Iridia now?" "No," Evan said, "but she does. And I'm the man who accidentally called her beautiful and now lives in her house. So you might want to believe me when I say I'll fight for her the same way I speak." With truth, the envoy hesitated. The soldiers didn't draw their weapons. Not that day. The foreign ships left before sunset. Nalani said nothing as they watched them disappear. But her hand reached for his, warm and steady. And in that simple touch, Evan Blake realized he had done something more than defend her. He had earned her. And maybe, finally, the bond was no longer only an accident. It was a choice. The days after the envoy's retreat unfolded with an air of soft celebration, but not the kind Evan was used to. There were no feasts, no booming toasts, no medals pinned to chests. Iridians honored peace with silence, reflection, and offerings to the earth. The fields bloomed brighter, as if the planet itself had exhaled. The vines that hung from the stone arches around Nalani's estate flowered overnight, thick with golden petals that shimmered like dawnlight. Evan walked those arches alone some mornings, letting the scent of those blossoms fill his lungs, unsure of what he was becoming. He had expected resistance, if not from the Iridians, then from Nalani, but she offered none. There was no doubt in her eyes when she saw him. No hesitation in her voice when she spoke his name. And yet, he still carried the fear. Fear that one misstep would unravel it all. One morning, while preparing to leave for a meeting with the Southern Defense Committee, Evan caught his reflection in the water basin outside his room. He barely recognized the man staring back. His posture had changed. His face had softened in some places, hardened in others. He looked like someone no longer waiting to return home. He found Nalani near the grove's edge, where the flowering trees formed a quiet veil. She was barefoot, her feet sunk into the moss, eyes closed in meditation. "I almost called it off," he said. Her eyes opened slowly, but she didn't speak. "The morning after the binding," he continued, "I sat in that room with Zara's warnings echoing in my head and thought, what am I doing tying my life to someone I barely know on a planet I barely understand?" She didn't move. "I've spent most of my life learning how to run before I'm pushed. I thought I was doing it again, just dressed up in ritual and silk." He expected disapproval, or worse, silence. Instead, Nalani nodded. "The bond forgives doubt. It was made to hold what changes." He looked at her, bewildered. "You're not angry?" She stepped forward, placed her hand gently over his chest. "You feared because you cared. If you had walked away without feeling anything, I would have known you were not meant for me." Evan felt something loosen in his chest. "So, what happens now?" She smiled softly. "Now we stop wondering whether the bond is real." That evening, he sat beside her on the stone bench near the central tree, watching the orbs of past unions glow overhead. He saw their own among them now, brighter than before. And for the first time, he stopped preparing for goodbye. He started building something instead. Peace never lingered long. Not in his old world. Not here. The mining envoy had left, but they hadn't retreated. Days later, a satellite picked up an unauthorized landing near the Basalt Flats, a region known for its rare mineral veins. Iridian scouts returned with grim news. Someone was drilling. Nalani summoned her council. Evan, now a respected voice among them, stood at her side. The debate that followed was tense. Some demanded retaliation, others restraint. Nalani listened to all but said little. When they turned to her for final word, she turned to Evan instead. "What would your world do?" He didn't flinch. "They'd send a strike team. Silent, fast, ruthless. And you?" "I'd go talk to them first." Some scoffed, but Nalani nodded. "Then we go together." Evan led the small envoy with Nalani at his side. They approached the outpost under the veil of night, their boots leaving no mark on the obsidian dust. The humans working the drills were startled to see them. They tried bluster first, then bargaining, then silence. "Take your machines and leave," Nalani said, voice low but firm. This world does not belong to your maps. The leader of the drill team, a sharp-jawed man named Commander Radix, sneered. You think love gives your soldier authority? We were told this place was unclaimed. Evan stepped forward. It isn't, and I do have authority. Not because I married her, because I chose her, and because I now carry the weight of this world on my back. Radix laughed. You think that makes you special? No, it makes me responsible. Behind him, the Iridian guards remained still as stone. If you stay, Evan said, voice iron, you won't see us coming next time. Radix stared for a long time, searching Evan's eyes for weakness. He found none. They left by morning. Back at the estate, Evan and Nalani stood again beneath the vow tree. Neither spoke for some time. You did not threaten him, she said eventually. I didn't have to. Your fire burns quieter now. It burns for something, finally. She placed a hand over his heart, and it burns beside mine. That night, in their private quarters, she asked him, without words, without ceremony, if he was ready. And Evan, who had once feared the permanence of a single word, now surrendered to everything it had grown into. Their bond was no longer a mistake. It was a promise, and it burned brighter than any flame he had ever known. The rainy season arrived suddenly. Iridia's sky shifted in color before the first drop touched the ground, turning from soft violet to steel gray, threaded with flashes of silver lightning. The vines thickened, the trees huddled closer, and the streams turned to rivers overnight. For the Iridians, it was a sacred time, when the land renewed itself, when the sky gave birth to growth, and the silence between the stars could finally be heard in the thunder. Evan stood at the threshold of the estate, watching the storm hammer the horizon, his arms crossed over a tunic that no longer bore his earth insignia. His uniform had long since been stored away. Not forgotten, he could never truly leave it behind, but laid to rest, as a part of him that belonged to another life. Behind him, Nalani moved through the halls like calm water. She did not walk with urgency, yet every step brought her where she needed to be. She wore no ceremonial robes, only a simple woven wrap the color of dusk, and her hair, usually braided in precise Iridian fashion, was left loose and flowing. You feel it too, she said as she approached. He nodded, like something's about to shift. Because it already has. She took his hand and placed it against the side of her belly. His eyes widened. It wasn't much, just the soft curve of a secret beginning, but it was real. He didn't speak, she didn't need him to. Outside, the storm thundered again, and he felt it not as noise, but as affirmation. He was no longer drifting. He was rooted now, in a world that had asked nothing of him but sincerity, and in return had given him a home. There was a knock on the outer gate not long after. Zara arrived, soaked through but smiling, her braids slapping against her back. A message from Earth, she said, handing him a sealed data pad. Evan opened it, expecting a recall order, perhaps even reprimand. What he found instead was a brief diplomatic acknowledgement of his status. Cultural envoy of Iridia, first human participant in binding union, liaison to the Dawn Circle. I guess they finally accepted it, he murmured. They had no choice, Zara replied. You've done what no diplomat managed in 20 years, and you did it by accident. He laughed. Sounds like me. She studied his face. Are you happy? He looked over his shoulder at Nalani, who was now coaxing light from the firestones in the corner, her presence like a steady drumbeat in his chest. Yes, he said. For the first time he didn't hesitate. When the rains passed, the world was remade. New blossoms hung from the canopy. The rivers were wide and singing. The vow tree had grown taller by inches in mere weeks, its orbs now glowing brighter with the added moisture and life of the season. Beneath its boughs, Evan sat with Nalani, her head resting against his shoulder. They said little. Words had always been the beginning of this story, but not its soul. Still, there were moments that called for them. Do you ever think about that day? She asked quietly. I do, he said. All the time. The moment you said it, I didn't know it would change everything. She lifted her head, studying his face with the same quiet intensity she'd held that very first day. Would you say it again? He turned toward her, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. His hand lingered on her cheek. I would. Then, slowly, like a vow that needed no priest, no witness, no law, only truth, he spoke. Beautiful. And this time, it wasn't a mistake. It was a promise. spoken with full knowledge of what it meant, with the depth of all the storms they had weathered and the roots they had laid down in each other's lives. Nilani smiled, tears gathering but not falling. She placed her hand over his heart once more, and the orb bearing their union, high in the vow tree, glowed until the rest of the world faded beneath it. Somewhere between the stars and the soil, between two species and one word, a new world had been born. And it was beautiful.